Welcome to another Friday night. We're continuing our look at some of the prisons that come out of complex trauma. And really what it is ways that the brain develops to cope with ongoing danger in a child that really become subconscious brain default settings. And so the person now in adult life realizes that those ways of coping kept them safe physically as a child, but now are really messing up their adult life, their relationships, their jobs, creating a whole lot of pain in their life. And so part of them wants to change, but there's part of them that resists changing. Part of them that keeps wanting to go back to that default because it feels so normal. And what I want to look at today is the default setting of jumping to the worst case scenario, jumping to conclusions that are extremely negative. And what happens for these people when that becomes their default setting is they live with this feeling of impending doom all the time, that something bad is about to happen, that catastrophe is about to strike, that the other shoe is about to drop. That's just there constantly in this gut feeling and deep inside of them. And much of the time, it's not based on evidence. It's not based on actual circumstances. It's their imagination. It's something inside of them that has created that. And it becomes a real problem for them. And we're going to look at that. So one way to look at this is if you look at the emotional world of a person that has this as their life trap, or if you look at the thinking of a person that has this as their life trap. So the most primary common feeling associated with a person who has the worst case scenario as their default setting, as their prison, is that they live with anxiety. The most common type of thought that comes to this person's mind is, what if? What if this happens? What if this happens? Every new situation, every suggestion that is being made, what if, what if, what if? So this life trap is also known as the vulnerability life trap. Always feeling vulnerable to danger, always feeling vulnerable to catastrophe. So it's a life trap that is two-pronged. The person, number one, exaggerates the risk of danger. And then secondly, they minimize their own capacity to cope. So they're blowing up the risk of danger and minimizing their ability to cope. And put those two together and you live with constant anxiety. The problem with this is that the fear that they're experiencing doesn't match the real level of danger. So anybody else from a very healthy, balanced place would look at that and go, that anxiety doesn't match the circumstances. So you're putting yourself in a place of anxiety, not based on circumstances, but based on some internal mechanism in your brain. That becomes the prison. Now, to me, it's so important to understand and approach this topic correctly and from childhood. So a lot of people that approach this topic see this anxiety, this jumping to conclusions, to worst case scenario, as a negative flaw. They hate it. They just want to change it. I want to come at it from a place of compassion and understand that the brain actually developed this way of coping as a way to protect the little child. And I want to understand what the little child was going through. And so if you look at the little child living in constant danger that they can't resolve and bad things consistently happening, what the brain then begins to do is, I need to start looking for negative. I need to constantly focus on finding problems. But then I need to start predicting when bad things are going to happen. So if I see a potential problem, if I see something negative, then I'm going to jump to the conclusion that I'm probably going to get hurt. And therefore now I'm going to go into fight or flight. When nothing bad has happened, I just see a possible hint of danger that now I predict something bad is going to happen. And now I'm going into fight or flight just because of one little negative thing that I see. And then that goes beyond just seeing danger. It's if I feel a negative emotion, and it originally was fear. If I saw fear, fight or flight. But now if I feel a bit of discomfort, if I feel a bit of anxiety, if I feel a bit of anger, if I feel a bit of depression, oh, I can't resolve it, something bad's going to happen, let's fight or flight. So now the point of fight or flight is not getting hurt. It's not actual danger. It's any negative thing or any negative emotion. I jump to conclusions and I fight or flight. So the brain thought it was protecting the child by getting them to fight or flight to escape earlier. But what they actually have done is created a prison. So the brain was thinking, if I expect the worst, then I can prepare for it and I can protect the child. But what they've actually done is, by expecting the worst, predicting the worst, jumping to conclusions, they now create an ongoing dangerous environment in the mind that cannot be resolved, that can only be escaped by fight or flight, and that keeps a person in prison. So let me have you think of it another way. What happened for that child in their growing up is they were in danger and they had many rational fears. They should have been afraid. Life was dangerous for them, but they couldn't resolve those fears. They couldn't fix the problem. And so what the brain has done is move back to create irrational fears as a way to try to protect them from the rational dangers. So irrational fear is now seen as the solution to danger. But what it actually does is creates an environment in the mind that's irrational, therefore not resolvable, and it becomes a prison for the person. So let me just give you a few examples. Hopefully that will help you relate to this fully. So how would you respond internally if your boss sent you a message, just an email, a text that says, I'd like to see you in my office? They don't say why. They just say, I'd like to see you in my office. Some of you would immediately jump to worst case scenario, jump to conclusions. I must have done something bad. I'm going to get fired. And you would be in a state all day long until that meeting took place. Let's say that you text your spouse, your partner, and they don't respond. They've gone out for the evening, you text them and they don't respond, and you wait for half an hour and they still haven't responded to your text. Where does your mind go? Does it go to worst case scenario? Something bad's happened to them. They're having an affair. Or are you able to go, oh, maybe something else is going on? That's okay. They're just busy. This is what we're talking about. Let's say that you wake up and you got a bit of a pain in your stomach area, and it's there the next day as well. Where does your mind go? Does it go, oh, I'm dying of cancer, oh, something terrible is happening? Or are you able to kind of just sit with it for a while and wait and see what happens? How about your friends ask you to go on a hike in the wilderness? You'll be living in a tent out in the middle of nowhere. There will be no cell phones, no internet. Where does your mind go that if you're thinking about going into the wilderness on a hike? Some of you would go to a very worst case scenario. Something bad's going to happen. Somebody's going to get hurt. There's going to be a wild animal. You just go to a very dark place. Final one. Your friend says they're going to pick you up at 9 o'clock. It's now 10 after 9 and there's no sign of your friend and you haven't heard a message from them. Where does your brain go? So all of those are just everyday type of events that could happen, and a person who has this life trap, this worst case scenario as a prison, their mind is going to go to a pretty dark place. Once this worst case scenario gets triggered, it takes you to an emotional place, but it also creates physical sensations. So you don't just go to fear, you go to other emotions and you get these physical sensations. So for some of you, if your spouse or your partner did not respond to your text within half an hour, all of a sudden you would feel your heart drop to your stomach, or it would feel like you got punched in the stomach. For some of you, then you would get almost like a brain fog. You couldn't think clearly. Your brain just got fuzzy. Or you would feel a tightness in your chest or a shortness in breathing. You would breathe more shallow, more rapidly, or a tightness in your throat. Some of you would go to just like feeling you got hit by a truck. You just exhausted. You just run over. You don't have any energy left. Others of you would go to this emotion of just feeling totally hopeless. Life sucks. What's the point? Give up. All of that would happen in a nanosecond once this got triggered. And so this trigger would just lead to this very intense negative place physically and emotionally. Now let me give you the test. So we normally give 10 questions. So 1, if it's completely untrue of you. 2, you answer if it's mostly untrue of you. 3, if it's slightly more true than untrue. 4, if it's moderately true. 5, if it's mostly true. And 6, if it describes you perfectly. And if you get in your answer a 5 or a 6 to any of the questions, then doesn't matter how low your score is, it's probably important for you to look at this as a possible issue for you. So question 1, I cannot escape the feeling that something bad is about to happen. 2, I feel that catastrophe can strike at any moment. 3, I worry about becoming a street person or homeless person. 4, I worry a lot about being attacked by a criminal, a mugger, a thief. 5, I worry about getting a serious illness, even though nothing has been diagnosed by a physician. 6, I am too anxious to travel alone on planes or trains. 7, I have anxiety attacks. 8, I am very aware of physical sensations in my body, new pains, aches, etc., and I worry about what they may mean. 9, I worry I will lose control of myself in public or go crazy. 10, I worry a lot about losing all my money or going broke. So scoring 10 to 19, the life trap probably doesn't apply to you. 20 to 29, it might apply to you occasionally. 30 to 39 could be an issue in your life. 40 to 49, probably an important life trap for you to consider. And 50 to 60, definitely one of your core life trap issues. Now, when we look at this worst case scenario, there's typically 4 themes that it revolves around for people. So for some people, they jump to worst case scenario primarily with health and illness issues. Others, finances, poverty issues. Third, call it losing control, and it's primarily concerned with mental health or psychological issues. Going crazy, panic attacks, having a breakdown, that's the main fear. That's where they jump to the worst case scenarios. And then 4, danger, and that's really seeing that the world is just unsafe. And so they're constantly obsessed with safety when they go out into the world. So where does this come from? This jumping to worst case scenario. So I gave you the overview. The brain is trying to protect a child from danger. Let me just break that down into various scenarios that this child might have grown up with. So number 1, they may have learned this life trap by growing up with a parent who had the same life trap. So their parent jumped to worst case scenarios. Their parent lived with this impending doom all the time, had all kinds of phobias, constant anxiety issues. And so the child just picked that up from the parent. That their nervous system became kind of connected and regulated to their parents. And that's where they got it. Secondly, they had a parent that was overprotective of them, particularly around areas of danger, going out into the world, or illness. So the parent was continually warning them of dangers, taking them to the doctor, making them feel that they were too fragile or incompetent to handle everyday issues. And so they were just made to always feel inadequate, made to feel that they couldn't handle danger, and so that just increased their anxiety. Or they had a parent who did not adequately protect them. So they lived with a childhood environment that was not safe physically, emotionally, financially. So the child was abused, the child was neglected, the child was lashed out at constantly. There was a lot of anger in the house. The child did not feel safe, they weren't safe, and the parents weren't protecting them. Or the child was sick regularly, or the child experienced a serious traumatic event, a car accident, and so that led you, coming out of childhood, to feel very vulnerable going into adult life. Or one of your parents experienced a traumatic event and perhaps died. And so all of a sudden, you grew up with the absence of a protector, you grew up with a parent that died or had a traumatic event, and so the world was extremely unsafe to you. It just magnified the danger of the world to you. Or you grew up with parents who, for whatever reasons, just saw the world as constantly this evil place full of danger, out to destroy you, and they just hammered that home all the time. They tried to keep you in a safe little enclave, whether it was a religious group, whether it was just family, but the world's just an evil, bad place. Another possibility for some is that they had a parent who, I guess the best way to say it is they always stuck their head in the sand. They denied how bad the world was. They denied how unsafe their neighborhood was. They denied how predatory their uncle was. They minimized. They just didn't want to deal with anything, didn't want conflict. And so they just denied, and tried to be positive about everything, but they refused to look at life accurately. And what you've come to realize, it's because of that you got hurt. You got a lot of bad things happen to you because your parents stuck their head in the sand. And now you refuse to do that. But instead of just looking at life accurately, you now just focus on everything negative. And you've made reality more scary than it actually is. And so if you had a parent that refuse to look at scary reality accurately, you can try to overcompensate, and that can be a problem. Another reason why some do this is that their home life followed a fairly consistent cycle. And it was really a cycle of violence. So there was the explosion where something really bad happened, people got hurt, but it was always followed by a honeymoon. Everybody was on their best behavior. There were gifts given. Everybody was super sweet. There was no conflict. Everybody got along. It was really, really nice. Everybody was super attuned to each other, super attentive to each other, meeting each other's needs, very loving to each other. It was wonderful. But nobody then dealt with any of the problems because they didn't want to create conflict. They didn't want to break the honeymoon. And so everything got stuffed down and buried. And then the tension built till there was another explosion. And so what comes out of that cycle for a child is that when things are going well, they start to get a feeling of impending doom. Because in their experience, that's what always happened. And so now they're pretty convinced that if things are going well, something bad's going to happen. The other shoe is going to drop. Another thing that can come out of complex trauma is that what was your normal things that happened in your home that always led to negative, you can begin to think that if those things happen today, it will always lead to negative. Let me give you an example. If dad talked louder than normal, then it usually meant dad was going to erupt and hit somebody. So now, if you hear somebody talking loudly, you think, they're about to get violent. When maybe that's just their culture. They just talk loudly when they're passionate about something, and getting violent is the furthest thing from their mind. But for you, dad getting louder than normal, danger sign. And so now when you hear somebody talking loudly, you jump to conclusions. Another thing for you is when mom started shutting cupboard doors more loudly than normal, bedroom doors more loudly, something bad was going to happen. So now when you hear somebody shut a door loudly, you jump to conclusions. That could be the same with mom banging pots and pans around in the kitchen. Your radar as a child picked up when it was a little bit out of normal, when it was a bit louder, a bit more sudden than she would normally handle pots and pans. And so now if you hear somebody handling pots and pans in that louder version, you jump to conclusions. In your home, conflict was never resolved. Conflict always led to bad. So now if you see conflict or experience conflict, you jump to conclusions. Somebody's going to get hurt, something bad's going to happen. It's not going to get resolved. So again, what was your normal always led to something bad. So if you see that today, you jump to conclusions. There's another thing, and that is if you grew up in a home or a culture that was characterized by a lot of injustice, so you kept hoping that justice would happen, that somebody would see the facts, that somebody would rule correctly on the facts, that justice would be done, that you would be heard, that life would be fair, but it never happened. What can happen today as soon as you see injustice is you go to anger, great anger, but then you go to this dark place of worst case scenario. You spiral into hopelessness, to panic, to deep pain and fear, because for you, lack of justice in your situation led to the belief that justice will never happen. And so that continues to trigger you to jump to worst case scenario today. So those are just some of the scenarios that kids can grow up with that lead to this life trap or prison default setting of jumping to conclusions of worst case scenario. So let me break down what that looks like in more specifics, that you can really look for some of the nuances in your own life. So a person with this would feel a lot of anxiety much of the time. And I have to say with that, it might not be anxiety at 8, 9, or 10, but it could be an anxiety level of a 3, 4, 5. And for some of you might not even realize that because it's your normal. You're not even aware of it. It's just part of who you are, you think, and you think everybody has that. But no, they don't. And so starting to become aware that, wow, I've got a low-grade anxiety all the time, that's significant. That you need to pay attention to, go, where does that come from? Connected to that would be you worry about your health and possible illnesses a lot. So you go to the doctor more often than maybe you need to because you're worrying about the latest ache or pain. You're talking to your family constantly about your health and looking to them for reassurance. And you can tell that they are getting tired of it, but you can't stop yourself. And then that leads to you just can't enjoy life because you're always worrying that you're going to get hurt or you're sick. Another one is you experience panic attacks as a result of, again, aches or pains, possible illnesses, and all of a sudden you're getting anxiety, panicking, or you get panic attacks due to needing a conversation with somebody and kind of panicking it's going to result in conflict or something bad happening. For many people, it's realizing that this sense of impending doom can just come over them out of the blue when things are going great. There's nothing in their circumstances that should create this sense of impending doom. It just falls on them out of the blue. Or you just begin to realize that you live with a constant sense of impending doom. It's not something that just comes out of the blue. It's just there all the time. You can't shake it. It kind of colors everything you do once you start to think about it. Sometimes you begin to realize this sense of impending doom comes at times when you don't feel in control. as much as you usually are. It's like you felt in control and then you had to kind of go to a little less control, impending doom, or you feel no control, wow, major impending doom. So it's very much tied to your feeling of being in control. Then you have this unrealistic worry that eats at you that you're going to run out of money. You've got a great job, you've got consistent paycheck, but it's just something that is constantly there, and that results in you just being a constant tightwad, unwilling to spend money on anything, unwilling to look at kind of career changes, etc., because I got to hang on to what's secure, unwilling to look at kind of any risks financially as investments or buying a new place, because that just is a preoccupation for you. Or you find you go to really exorbitant lengths to avoid criminal danger. So you don't go out at night. You don't visit large cities. You don't travel on public transportation. So you begin to realize that your life is actually quite restricted because you're trying to protect yourself from these dangers of being in public. Or you begin to realize you avoid a lot of situations because they seem to have a little bit of risk. And that could be taking the elevator, going on a subway, flying, living in a city where there might be an earthquake. It's just, you begin to realize there's some phobias there that cause you to be very risk aversive about certain things. Some, you begin to realize that one of the reasons you picked your partner was that you saw your partner as strong, capable, confident, who could protect you. And they could take care of all the risks. They could take care of making sure your anxiety was at bay. They were there to be that protector for you. And so you became overly dependent on your partner. And part of you might resent the fact that you're so dependent on them to give you those feelings of security, but part of you can't stop being so dependent on them. Some, you begin to realize that all of this anxiety has actually resulted in physical symptoms. It's created your stress system being activated all the time, so now you have irritable bowel syndrome, colitis, Crohn's disease, ulcers, asthma, eczema, other stress-related stuff that comes from so much cortisol in your system, autoimmune things that are beginning to happen for you as a result of this constant anxiety that's there from jumping to worst-case scenario. Others, they begin to realize that they've limited their social life because of their fears. They don't do things that normal people do socially, and it's really because you have so many fears. Then you might begin to realize that it's your fears, you just haven't restricted your own activities, but now you've tried to restrict what your family does, so they've had to adapt their lives to your fears. Now they're restricting their lives because of your fears. So it's no longer just affecting you, it's now affecting them and restricting them. And then you might begin to realize that you're passing on your fears to your children. You're trying to hammer home to them constantly, they need to be aware of this, they need to be afraid of this. And you're creating very much a fear orientation in your children. Some of you realize that this has got to the point that you now have developed behaviors to try to ward off your constant fear. So you've become obsessive compulsive. You're constantly washing your hands, checking things. You have a germ phobia. You got to count in your head. All of those different things, you're trying to manage your fears, ward off your fears. Some of you have got into superstitious thinking that if you just did this and this, and that's going to make sure you're safe. That can become a thing. Others, you can have begun to rely excessively on medication, alcohol, food to try to reduce your chronic anxiety. So it's something that doesn't stay stagnant. It continues to grow and take over relationships, affect your family, affect your children. Then it begins to affect your health. Then you begin to use other ways of coping, and that just keeps growing and growing. Another important thing to look for, if this is part of your default setting, is that you tend to focus on negative. You tend to become quite negative and critical. You find flaws in everything. You find fault in everything. That's the first thing you notice when you are in a new situation, is what's wrong with it. When you meet somebody, their flaws. So your focus is, you are a negative mindset. Your negative focus. Another thing to look for is that you become famous for responding to other people's ideas with, but what about this? But what if this happened? Now, there's a time when that can be very wise. But for you, what people begin to realize is that you're always doing it too much, focusing only on danger, not seeing a big, accurate picture. You're just wanting to see negative. Then look for the reality that if this is your default setting, you've developed a mind game, a gymnastics in your brain, where you've tried to convince yourself that what you're doing is wise. You've actually developed a self-righteousness that causes you to look down on people because they don't take as many precautions as you. They don't look at life and see all the dangers, and therefore they get hurt. They don't take care of their children the way you take care of their children. They're not as careful as you, and therefore they're putting their children at risk. And so you've got ways to justify it and even feel self-righteous about it. Look for the reality that you probably have developed some superstitions. So people that develop superstitions are developing it to avert fear, to avoid something bad happening. So begin to look for any superstitions that you have in your life. Next, many people that have been in this life trap for a long time begin to become prone to conspiracy theories. They listen to doomsday prophets because the world's an evil place. The world's going to hell in a handbasket. And so they spend lots of time listening to the news, checking for the latest catastrophe. They feed on that. They like the adrenaline rush of that. It keeps their mind obsessed. And there's something that's addictive about that. But they're just focused more and more. They need a conspiracy theory to keep all of this alive. Another thing to look for is that you're constantly on guard. You can't ever relax. You're constantly vigilant, but that means you're constantly tense, especially when you're in a new social setting. A final thing for some people with this, just to be aware of, is that they need a black and white world. They cannot allow for gray. So go back to the situation where your boss sends you a message and says, I'd like to see you. It doesn't say why. A black and white says they want something, they want to fire me, I've done something bad, I'm going to get called on the carpet and they're going to tear a strip out of me. That's a black and white world. I can deal with that. I can prepare for that. And so you need the black and white. But it could be your boss. Actually, they might want to call you on the carpet. It could be that. But it also could be they want to give you a good report. They want to praise you. They want to ask you for your advice about something. They value you. It could be something very good. The problem is you don't meet your boss till tomorrow. So you got to sit in the unknown for a day. And sitting in the unknown is sitting in the gray where you don't know. Is it going to be bad? Is it going to be good? I don't know. So a person with the worst case scenario life trap can't tolerate that. They need to know so they can prepare for it. So it seems to make more sense to jump to conclusions that are black and white, because at least I can prepare for that. But man, you make life terrible for yourself. So let me just take all of this and play it out and play the tape to the end. So the brain initially developed this to protect the child. But what I want you to see is when you do this as an adult, you actually create what you were trying to prevent. You create the opposite of what you're trying to get. So you continue with this worst case scenario, jumping to conclusions, putting yourself in this place of anxiety, always preparing for something bad. That begins to affect your relationship. You need others to reassure you all the time. It drains the people that love you because they see how irrational your fear is, that they can't reason with you, that you're constantly coming to them for reassurance, and they just start putting up boundaries with you. They can't deal with you, and you feel rejected. You feel in even more danger. And you begin to lose the relationships you value. Beyond that, all your energy internally now is going into preparing for bad, thinking about bad, worrying about bad. It's being in a negative emotional place. That means you don't have energy to enjoy life. You don't have energy to socialize. You're worrying about what might happen, and you're not able to enjoy the present. So it begins to restrict you, then debilitate you, and keep you in a very negative place. So you're not able to enjoy life because you're always preoccupied with worrying about the future. So you slowly lose your joy for life. You end up in a constant growing state of fear, anger, and hopelessness. It's a dark place. What I want you to see is you actually create complex trauma for yourself, just in your mind. You create an unsafe world just through your thinking. But you also create it for your children, because now you're not safe to them. If they try to attune to you, they find a very fearful person, a very dysregulated person, because they're connecting to your inner world, and that's their sense of security comes from that, and they're finding that you're very insecure, so now they're not insecure, they're insecure, so you're creating complex trauma for yourself and for your children. So what I want you to see is that this life trap makes you a bottomless pit. It can't be resolved. It doesn't matter what you do, you cannot alleviate the feelings of danger. No matter what you do, it's never enough. Your brain will still find something negative, something bad, some worst case that you can't fix. So it becomes this bottomless pit of constant attention trying to fix it, but never being fixable. So life now is not about seeking joy and fulfillment. Life is about preventing danger. That's the entire preoccupation and focus. So this life trap damages your ability to enjoy life. It restricts life. It makes life a prison of danger. It is a terrible place to live. So let me go to some of the dangers to be aware of in recovery. And I only want to give 3 just that to me are highlights. So for some people with this life trap, they have the wrong standard for looking for a partner, for evaluating a partner. So they're not looking for a partner who is healthy. They're looking for a partner who can take care of them. So somebody that looks fearless, somebody that has lots of money and a good job and is physically strong, somebody who is a medical professional, they look for that because then if they have that kind of partner, they'll feel safe. And so they are operating by the wrong standard. So what they're not realizing is that that person could be very unsafe. That person could have huge trauma of their own that they've not dealt with, and it's going to end up being a terrible relationship. So be aware that this affects how you pick a partner if you don't deal with your own stuff. Secondly, be aware that If you don't deal with your own stuff and you're constantly going to people with your latest irrational fear, you're going to wear out people and they're going to start to put up boundaries, and pretty soon nobody's going to want to hang around with you. And so you're going to end up all alone again, and that's only going to make things worse. Next one is be very aware that for many people, getting wrapped up in all of the latest catastrophes, the latest conspiracy theories becomes an addiction. It fuels this adrenaline rush. It fuels this sense of righteousness. And that, for many people, they just keep going into it as an addiction. And what I have seen for so many people is if that happens, they stop growing in their recovery. They only grow so far, and then the addiction takes over again. And it's very much operates by the same things as a drug addiction, as an alcohol addiction. It becomes their total focus, their way of coping, preoccupation, obsession, and everything else suffers. So what do we do about healing? Begin by understanding where this life trap came from. Understand why the brain developed it to protect the child. What was the child going through? What was the child experiencing emotionally? Then make a list of the specific fears that have come out of what that child went through. So don't just talk in general fears, but really begin to look at specific fears. Don't worry if they're rational or irrational. Just write down every specific fear that you have. Now, we've done a whole video that goes through 60 some different fears that people can have. You might want to look at that. Then develop a hierarchy of fears. So this is my greatest fear. This is my next greatest fear. This is my smallest fear. See if you can start to develop an order or priority to your fears. Then find people you can talk to this about and say, what I realize is I developed this worst case scenario as a way to try to survive, but it has become a problem. And I now have rational fears and irrational fears. I don't even know the difference. I know that when I get triggered, I go into patterns of thinking, patterns of emotions, patterns of behavior that are very unhealthy. I'm going to need help. And I don't want to wear you out. And so I'm going to need to respect your boundaries, and you're going to need to tell me when you think the fear is irrational. You got to have communication with those close to you, and you got to have people who have wisdom and understand healthy, who can walk beside you as you do this. When you feel a fear, one of the first things that you can do to see if it's irrational is just ask yourself, realistically, what's the probability that this will happen? So if it's going on the airplane and you're saying, we're going to crash, look at the statistics. What is the probability of that happening? Start with refuting the fear with evidence, not just trying to talk yourself out of it. But you got to go beyond just refuting the fear with evidence. You got to go back to that little child. What was that little child experiencing? So go to internal family systems, if that's helpful for you, and talk to the fear part, who actually kind of became like a person inside of you trying to protect that little child. And ask that fear part, what are you trying to protect the child from? What are you afraid will happen if you're not here to protect the child? Begin working with the fear, not as the enemy, but as somebody who had the child's best interest in heart, as somebody who is trying to protect the child. Understand what the child was going through. Don't judge the child. Have compassion for the child. Understand the child, and then be there for the child, so that you're eventually able to say, fear part, you don't need to be the protector anymore. I will protect this child. I will listen to the child. I will help the child understand rational from irrational fears and make sure that you're safe. So what some people find helpful is to take each fear and make a flashcard and begin to go, okay, I have a fear of flying. What do I need to do on this? Okay, I have a fear of going out at night. What do I need to do about this? What are practical things I can do to begin to address this fear? Where did it come from? What can I do about it? So you begin to tackle each of your fears individually from the top down and from the bottom up by looking at the lies, looking at the probabilities, but also from the bottom up, from dealing with the fear part, with the inner child, and you begin looking at practical things that you can do. Part of that becomes starting to distinguish between irrational fear, rational fear. There's probably within a fear still some healthy stuff, but there's some unhealthy, irrational stuff. So I need to distinguish my fear into what's the healthy part, what's the unhealthy part. That is very important. But then I need to learn to sit in and tolerate the distress of the irrational fears, not to act on it, not to, when I get triggered, to go back into the old ways of coping. I need to learn to tolerate, knowing nothing bad's going to happen. I'm going to feel this in my limbic brain, but I'm going to get back to my cortex, and I'm going to act in my cortex, not out of my limbic brain. That is so critical in starting to heal this. Get to my cortex, act out of my cortex, tolerate my limbic brain who's screaming and carrying on. Another thing is to do mindful relaxation practices every day. Become aware of the anxiety in your body. Have breathing exercises, meditation exercises that help you get to a calmer, more relaxed place. So if you have this worst case scenario prison and you're starting to realize it, understand that this is a process in healing. You just don't change this overnight. This comes from deeply ingrained adaptations that the brain had to protect the little child. And it's going to take you a while to get them from your subconscious brain to your conscious and begin to change them. But it's possible. And I hope this will just help you become more self-aware, give you some understanding of it, and some beginning tools in starting to change it. Well, that's another Friday. I hope, again, this is practical and helpful. Have a great weekend. We'll see